Aloha and good evening. My name is Jürgen Steinmetz, joining you from the World Tourism Network and eTurbo News in Honolulu, Hawaii. Tomorrow is World Tourism Day, and tomorrow is really not tomorrow where our guest is today, where Professor Jeffrey Lipman is, who you see on the other screen, because it's already today. Today is World Tourism Day, and we're going to talk a little bit more what it means, and we have some interesting news I wanted to share with you. And so before we welcome Professor Lipman in Brussels, who most of you probably know, I wanted to tell everyone here today, happy World Tourism Day. And World Tourism Day this year is organized by PATA, of course, organized by the Pacific Asia Travel Association, together with the World Tourism Organization in Bali, Indonesia. And Bali, Indonesia is the official host of World Tourism Day. And I think if World Tourism Day was ever important, it's this year, because we're all coming out of a crisis we've never ever experienced in tourism, and we're going to a new chapter. So we have to rethink tourism, and this is really what the World Tourism Day is about. In addition to this, our own organization has great news. Also in Bali, our Indonesian chapter just today, on the occasion of World Tourism Day, opened an office. And our office is in the Bali Creative Hub. It's a hub with a lot of artists, shops, and so forth. So if you are in Bali, we're going to have the address on our website, wtn.travel. Say hello. It's under the leadership of Moody Asturi. Moody is a tourism pioneer, has been in this industry for 25 years and more. And we're really excited to start this on World Tourism Day 2022. Jeffrey, of course, is an old friend of mine, and I'm not saying old literally, we're all old, but he has an amazing record of being actually the first CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council, the Assistant Secretary General for the World Tourism Organization. He was with IATA, and now everyone who knows knows Jeffrey from our various events and video events he is the expert in climate change. And Jeffrey, it's such an honor to have you here on World Tourism Day. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Thomas, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Congratulations on opening the office in Bali. Congratulations to renewing your long-time friendship with Moody, because I think probably the people watching this show don't realize, but you pretty much started off your tourism career in Indonesia, and I think with Moody and her husband, as I recall. You see, I do have this long relationship with you. And by the way, just as an aside, I read this beautiful poem that you put up on one of your channels, telling us that we actually have two lives, and the second life only begins after we realize that we only have one life. I thought that was a very clever, and at this age, I have to say, a very apt poem, because as you get older, you realize, you have a finite time span.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I don't want to.
Does.
Yeah, absolutely. In this poem, I don't want to take credit for it because the poem was sent to me by WhatsApp by our good friend, the Honorable Edmund Bartlett, the Minister of Tourism from Jamaica. Yes. He shared this, and I thought, it's something really special. I really, like you did, enjoyed reading it. So I forwarded it to you and to some other friends, and maybe we just put it on eTurbo News so our readers can also enjoy it.
Yeah, I think you should put it up. It's, to anybody, I never looked at as age as a factor in my life, ever, at any phase of it, until more recently, and particularly in the light of the climate crisis, which I know we're going to talk about today, and the realization that there's a next generation out there who are going to be living a totally different life than the one that we lived. and we experience it every day. We see it on in the media, on the news channels. We see a flood in Pakistan, and because we're so used to this kind of thing, it floats over us. But I know when I talk to my kids, and I have grandkids, wonderful grandkids in their teens, and when I talk to them, they think about this new world as the real world, the daily world. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you after so many years that we've done things together and we've been good friends over these years, and really a pleasure to appear on your show because I think you've been the stalwarts in travel and tourism of keeping your eye on the ball.
Yeah, and actually,
You're not always popular as a consequence of it, but it's been a good ride, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
yeah, no, it's a pleasure. It's here. I actually have been in this business since 1978, but Indonesia really made an impact because eTurbo News was started in Indonesia, in Bali, out of Faisal's hotel, the Kulkul Hotel, in 1999, 2000. So it is really a circle that today on World Tourism Day, we're reopening office of our chapter in Indonesia. So I'm really excited about it. But Jeffrey,
And Thomas, if I may just, I'm sorry, I know you want to. We ought to talk about what we said we were going to talk about, which is the climate crisis and what the tourism industry is doing and is not doing and should be doing. But I just wanted to say that I too have a very strong link with Bali because in 2012 I I led or I co-led with my friend Terry DeLacy from Victoria University in Australia, and we did a strategic study for the then tourism minister of Indonesia, who you will know well, Gerd Ardika, wonderful man, and we did a massive study which was supposed to chart a green growth path for Bali. So I spent several months going back and forwards and working very closely with the tourism industry and learning so much that you can only learn when you go there and you listen to the local people and you understand that we all have the same challenges, but everybody has them from their own perspective. Somebody once said, you know, the future is me-shaped, and that's how we tend to think about these things. So yeah, it's good to reflect on Bali as we talk about World Tourism Day and its impact on climate change this year, or climate change impact on World Tourism Day.
And that's definitely timely also because when you rethink the travel and tourism industry, climate change has a big part of it, doesn't it, Jeffrey?
Well, I mean, I think when you seriously look at the future, you have to understand that climate change is the dominant force which is going to change our life. We've all grown up with familiar weather patterns. We don't think about this very often, but weather patterns have dictated our lives. And we went on holiday where we could go to the sun. Hawaii as a destination has only really, not only, but predominantly been seen as a wonderful vacation and sunspots but all that is changing in front of our eyes. And I think this is a good day to reflect on that and what it means for tourism. You know, forest fires, massive floods, hurricanes, droughts, climate refugees, these are becoming more and more the norm. And none of that is good for tourism. None of it. So
Yeah.
we have to start getting used. If we rethink tourism, we've got to sort of rethink tourism on a change on a really changing planet.
And of course, this is not a problem what just emerging today. You've been a leader in tourism and climate change for quite some time, and you have a very famous mentor, don't you, who got you really thinking about the importance of climate change.
Yeah, and that's basically, and I thank you for bringing up Maurice Strong, as you say, my friend and mentor for 25 years till from the time of the Rio Earth Summit, when I first really met him, just before the summit, and right until his death in 2015, the year that the world finally got a really serious climate agreement in Paris. And for 25 years, I learned from Maurice. I traveled around the world with Maurice. We launched the first serious sustainability program for tourism, which was called Agenda 21 for Travel and Tourism in 1995, immediately after the Rio Earth Summit. And this is a man who saw where we are today 50 years ago, because Maurice was the first Secretary General of the first ever global climate summit, not the Rio one in 92, but the Stockholm one in 1972, 20 years before that. And so he was preaching that climate change is the biggest problem facing mankind 50 years ago, when only a small bunch of climate scientists were saying the same thing.
Yeah, and it's become such a relevant topic and such a real problem. I mean, if you see just tomorrow, Florida might be hit by a Category 2, if not even a Category 4 hurricane. When I look here, I live in Hawaii, what is a tourism-dependent area. For those of you who are watching us, if you remember in the 1980s, when I moved here, we had a wonderful white sandy beach in Waikiki, like in front of the Sheraton Hotel. That's all gone. And we don't really realize the impact climate change has on regions, but on the entire world. So what are we going to do? I mean,
well, I remember that beach very well, Thomas, because in those days I was living in Canada from 1966 to 1976, as you said, working for IATA, and as I did for a further 10 years till the mid 80s. And if you wanted to go anywhere in Southeast Asia, the fastest way was to go across the Pacific, and you had a break point in Hawaii. And I remember, I think we always stayed at the Ilikai Hotel. I don't know if it's still there, but
oh yeah,
that was,
I can almost look at the Ilikai from where I'm at now. Yes, it's still here.
yeah. And the beach was magnificent in those days. Sadly, I haven't been back for a long time. But if you were going down to the South Pacific, going in and going out, that was where you went through Hawaii. And that's because the aircraft had their flight limitations. That's been another incredible phenomenon during the last 20 years, how we've seen the range of the aircraft increase, and the flight patterns change as all the airlines have sprung up in the Middle East and become, the dominant hub now. You don't need to pass through Hawaii to get to Australia.
Yeah, and I remember these times very well. I know when Singapore Airlines had a regional hub here in Honolulu, when every airline flying from Asia to the US mainland had to stop here. And this actually was the reason I moved here, because my first company dealt with Korean visitors coming to the United States, and they all had to go through Honolulu. So yes, I remember these times, and now we have non-stop flights going all the way from New Zealand to London. I mean, this world definitely has changed.
Absolutely. And to go back to my friend Morris, in 1972, he was tagged by the UN. He was a Canadian. He'd been working in the UN since he first started when he was 17, when he was a young guy, just working in the pass office at the UN, and it got to him. The UN was his life. He worked with many secretary generals. He was Under Secretary General himself 9 times, with 7 different Secretary Generals, and he was the guy who persuaded Ted Turner to put the $1 billion, as you remember, into the UN Foundation.
Right.
He was the ultimate United Nations man, and he was attacked by the extreme right in the United States on climate change as what they called a globalist, someone who was thinking global and not thinking and putting America first. So he was an incredible man. In 1972, he got this Congress to organize before there'd ever been one. The organization was a little bit of a mess when he was appointed. And at that time, the world was also different. There was the developed world as it is today, different coalitions, different players, different dominances. And then there was what was called the Group of 77, which was all of the developing countries. And the Group of 77 was led by Mrs. Gandhi from India. And I know Morris told me this, and it's part of his history. That's at the time that first summit depended on the Group of 77, the developing countries, attending, because what they had indicated is they would boycott the summit, because it was basically there to protect the continuing influence of the developed world, and particularly on the climate issue, because all the pollution was and mostly is coming and has historically come from the industrialized states. It's fossil fuel, industrial revolution, Western society produced. And the Group of 77, the world's poorest country, led by India, one of the world's most populous countries, simply said, we're having nothing to do with it. So without telling anybody, and in those days when flying was not easy, Morris flew to India and sought an appointment. He had no appointment, and he went to the center of government, and he asked for an interview with Mrs. Gandhi because he was the Secretary General of this emerging conference. And he got an interview. This was typical Morris Strong. He didn't care. He flew there, and he got an interview with Mrs. Gandhi. And he tells this story. He went into her office, and she was on one side of the desk, and she told him to sit down. He sat down, and she looked across the desk at him. She's a very powerful woman, Mrs. Gandhi, very, very visionary woman. And she said, you've flown halfway around the world to try to persuade me to a conference that I'm not going to go to. Why have you done this, Mr. Strong? Why is it important that I be there? And she looked at him, and she didn't say any more. And Morris thought, well, I'm not sure that she said everything that she wants to say, so I'll be quiet. And Mrs. Gandhi didn't say any more for what he later tells me was the longest 90 seconds of his life. But Morris had lived as a young boy of 16, 17 in Canada. He'd gone up north, living with the Inuit Eskimos. And it seems that in the evening, the Inuit Eskimos, they go into their igloos and they don't talk. They just sit and reflect on the world that they live in. And Morris had learned this. So he sat for 90 seconds facing really the most powerful woman in the world at that stage. And then he said, she leaned across and she said, well, Mr. Strong, I'm waiting. And he said, Mrs. Gandhi, he said, you are the most important woman, the most important person in the world as far as this conference is concerned. If you come to the conference, it could be a success and it could change the future of humanity. And if you stay away, it will definitely be a failure, and it will definitely mark the decline of humanity. And she looked at him and she looked at him for another 90 seconds. And then she leaned across the desk and she shook his hand and she said, I will be there, Mr. Strong.
Wow.
And that was it. He left and he flew back. And I have a picture somewhere of of Morris welcoming Indira Gandhi to the 1972 summit. And that was 50 years ago. And that was the start of the global environment movement and of the series of international conferences, events that have been actually led by the United Nations, the Brundtland Commission, in the creation of the IPCC, which I'd like to talk a little bit later about, in 1988. Morris created the IPCC as a science-based body built on the United Nations Environment Programme, which he was the first executive director of and took it to Africa, to Nairobi, and the World Meteorological Organization. They are the parents of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he created it so that when they got to Rio 4 years later, there would be no dispute about the numbers around climate change. Nobody able to say, the science doesn't prove it. It produced its first report for that Rio summit, and it took out a huge amount of the white noise that you always get around international meetings. And we had the IPCC in 1988, the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. Then we had more big meetings. We had the launch of the UN Framework Conference on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Biodiversity Convention, all in the framework of this 1992 conference, which created Agenda 21 for travel and tourism. Agenda 21. And later when I was at WTTC, we then worked with Morris's Earth Council to do an Agenda 21 for travel and tourism. And that, I think, was one of the first initiatives of tourism into this area. Then you had the Millennium Development Goals. You had the Kyoto Conference on the ozone layer in 1997. You had the Millennium Development Goals dealing with poverty in 2000. You had Rio Plus 10 in 2002 in South Africa. I was there. You had Rio Plus 20 in 2012, which was kind of giving a new spur to the Millennium Development Goals. Then you had 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. And so all these times you've had this UN presence with thousands of meetings. I remember the COP in Bali. You talked about Bali. That must have been about 2017. Maybe it was earlier. It's hard for me to get all the dates in line, but there's been this tremendous confluence and build-up of activity, and now to the stage where pretty much everybody recognizes that there is a climate challenge, and everybody's making declarations about it. But the fundamental issue now is, how can we take action? Everybody in the world has to take action. Every industry, every sector, and tourism is up there saying that we're a leader everywhere it goes. How many people you see on Facebook and LinkedIn, and they post something that says, I did another leadership thing today. And the best leadership thing we can do is to really get our heads around and our actions around climate response.
Now, if you look back,
that was a long answer to a short question. I'm sorry, it's the age. You ramble a bit as you get older.
No, definitely. That's exactly what we need, because you can really tell the story, so people really get an idea about the time frame that went by between 1992 and now. So if you look back from what your initial reason was for this conference and where we stand today, are you satisfied where we are today, or would you say it's a huge success, we're on the right track, or we're behind, or we're way behind? How do you see it?
We're behind. The whole world is behind. The IPCC latest report says, and nobody talks about this, says that we have to peak our emissions, not just carbon, but our greenhouse gas emissions, because there's a lot of other stuff out there which is sometimes much worse than carbon. We have to peak total global emissions by 2025 if we want to be on track for getting to 1.5 degrees, only 1.5 degrees increase on the long-term historical levels by 2050. So we've got 25 more years, more or less, 28 years, and we have to peak the emissions in 25. We have to halve them in 2030. And, you know, you've heard this expression, everybody says we have to have net zero by 2050. I believe we have to have absolute zero by 2050. You can't be continuing to produce emissions as if you're special and letting everybody, and then saying, but it's okay because I've planted trees somewhere else. You know, this is the guy who says, I'm going to give up smoking. And then he pays somebody in Africa to stop smoking, and he's still a 3-pack a day man.
So what is the way forward? I mean, how are you going to achieve what you said we need to achieve?
Well, I think you would need Einstein to probably answer that question. It's clearly more of the same. I mean, I don't want to denigrate the actions that have been taken by all parts of the tourism ecosystem, countries, cities, organizations, and everybody, and the famous Glasgow Declaration of last year, which we at Cenex Malta were signatory to. But we made a very strong point when we signed it that it doesn't go far enough, fast enough. And I think, you know, that I'm even more sure of today. We have to go further. We have to go faster. Every sector, every place on the planet will have to do this differently because the circumstances of every destination is different. But we have to be absolutely adamant that we are going to try to peak emissions in 25. And I don't think anybody else in the tourism industry has even started to say that. And certainly if you look at our airline friends in IATA, their plan is that they will have net zero by 2050, but they'll still be emitting a huge amount of polluting gases, and they'll compensate for it by offsets and other stuff, and it's not good enough. I mean, you know, just to be very clear, and I'm happy to say this on your show, and I'm going to repeat it till I'm pushing daisies. If there is a polluting aircraft in play in 2049, it should be taken out of service, just like the cars. It's just like the cars. And then I think every one of us has to focus on their particular area and see how they can play their part in what is a massive change in the way we behave, in the way that we use fossil fuels, that we take for granted what we assumed before because it isn't going to be the case. And it's a constant learning process. And Thomas, for me, there are two things. Number one, the next generation. They're the ones who will have the biggest problem, and they're the ones who are showing the real leadership in responding to it. That's one thing. And the second thing is the science. I think there's enough information out there now to help us to move forward in a better way. It's just so diffuse. It's just, there's so much of it. It's coming at you every day on the internet. And one of the things I'd like to just sort of reference today, and I've spoken to you about this before, but I've been involved with this Sustainable Tourism Global Center in Saudi Arabia. I know you're very familiar with how the Saudi tourism market is transforming incredibly, how Saudi Arabia is transforming. And Gloria Guevara, the last president of WTTC, who's a longtime friend of mine, former minister in Mexico, she pulled together a number of people like myself who've been around for a long time, and she made us into sort of envoys for this center, a kind of an advisory group. And I'm working on a project with that center, which I hope we'll be able to unveil at the COP this year, which is trying to get the climate scientists who are involved in tourism to give some sort of collective direction to help the policymakers make the right decision. So I think it's two things. It's the next generation, and it's making sure that tourism adapts to Paris 1.5 using the climate and tourism, the climate science and the tourism expertise.
So, Jeffrey, just for clarification, Gloria now is the advisor, or one of the top advisors for the
chief advisor
chief
to the
advisor, I
Minister
guess,
of
for the
Tourism.
Minister of Tourism from Saudi Arabia. But of course, there's a lot of money behind it, and I think that's what this industry needs. Doesn't it need a lot of money to keep tourism alive, so it can function in a clean way?
I think it needs a lot of vision, first of all. I think, you know, if you look back, if you want an example of why money doesn't do everything, look no further than your last president in the United States. What it needs is vision, objectivity, decency. Climate justice is a hugely emerging and important issue for the world's poorest countries. I mean, Pacific nations are kind of island states are looking at whether they have a future at all, and how fast are the waves going to rise above their country. So I think having an ethos, having a mindset, and I'm not talking about morality, I'm talking about decency, having a decent approach to the way the sector will change and should change. That's the first thing. And yes, money, but money used intelligently. You know that I've been running for the past 5 years SunX Malta, and thanks to the government of Malta, we're one of the few NGOs in the world that doesn't have to look for money all the time. But the grant that we have from the government of Malta is tiny compared to, you know, what the members of WTTC or the airlines in IATA or big hotel companies have passing through their hands. And I think we've achieved a lot in a small period of time, and we've developed a concept of climate-friendly travel, which keeps everybody's eye on Paris 1.5. There's nothing clever about it. It's everybody has to make their own change plan to be able to meet this global evolution. But you have to keep, you know, it's like losing weight. It's no good saying just before New Year, I'm going to get slim in the new year, and then continue eating as you have done previously. But everybody has to change in a broadly coherent way. And money is important, but it's not everything, Thomas. You know, money is essential, but vision and commitment and decency in the approach, I think, are the most important things.
Now, how would you answer every time we publish this, or we get responses also from some of our readers and many others saying, okay, what guys like you are doing is destroying our industry. There's not going to be any more tourism. You want people to walk to Hawaii or swim? What is your response to this?
Well, first of all, people have been saying that kind of thing, you know, probably since we crawled out of the primeval swamp, you know, probably some reptile turned to the other and said, you're destroying the creatures that live underwater. I mean, this is evolution. Our industry, all industries, are going to have to change. The bottom line is, if we don't change, you're destroying your children and your grandchildren. You're destroying the world in every way that we've become familiar with it. So I don't buy into that line. And I think our industry has shown enormous capacity to change and to adapt. It's only 100 years ago since the first 120 years ago since the first flight took place in the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk. And how did they start the aviation part of our industry? They took a bicycle and put wings on it. And that first flight was just under the space inside a Boeing 747. So the first flight 100 years ago. So our industry will evolve. We see it. There are my friend Jed Brown has an initiative called Low Season Traveler, and he's trying to get people to travel in the period when previously they hadn't traveled, which he says will help deal with over tourism and will help deal with the troughs that people have in their business planning. So I think it's a false statement of that this is destroying our industry. I would say this is going to save our industry.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you, Jeffrey. Well, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and I think we can talk about this subject a lot more, and we will. And but today is World Tourism Day. So, what is your what are your wishes for today's day, for World Tourism Day?
Well, first of all, I wish you a big success with your new office in Bali, because
you.
in the end of the day, it's those things which are the little things between people that matter. I kind of hope that I keep my marbles for a few more years so I can go on doing this kind of thing, because it's what I enjoy doing. And I just want people to remember that climate change is existential, that tourism is a really important, vital part of the global being, not just of the global economy, of the way we are as humanity, and that we shouldn't be passive about responding to this. We should develop a climate vision, a climate action plan, and for those people who are interested, and excuse me for plugging this, you should take a look at our registry that we've created, climatefriendly.travel. It's free, everything's free, free resilience assessments, free support for your own climate plannings. We're training young students. We put 30 through last year, the first cohort. This year, we're taking 50 young people from the world's poorest country and 4 from Ukraine, and we're putting them through training to help the tourism industry. You can find 90% of what you want to make the change if you spend some time on Google, but not many people are doing this. So we've got young students who we make interns who are there to help people who want to see how they can specifically change. And I like this work we're doing with the young people. So one of my wishes is that we can continue doing that. It's stimulating, and I think it's making a contribution. And we're launching a podcast today, Thomas, with Jed Brown, to profile those companies who do join the registry, and to make them. You remember Kennedy's Profiles in Courage? Well, we're doing a profile of the interesting companies who decide that they want to be supporters of climate-friendly travel, and Jed is interviewing them every week. And I wanted to use this occasion on your show on World Tourism Day to announce that podcast.
Yeah, and that gives me an idea, Jeffrey. So why don't we add a menu point on our website at wtn.travel or worldtourismnetwork.org, same website, and you can go to home, you can go to pay your bill, but you can also go to a register for the Climate Change Directory. So I'm going to put this up tonight, and hopefully that will raise even a little bit more awareness over time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And as always, it's just a pleasure. And Zoom is so wonderful, the Teams, all of these new electronic communications, because when we first started to know each other so many years back, we couldn't have done this. We'd be checking to see how much our mobile phone bill was, and we wouldn't be able to see each other. So yeah, I'm very grateful for what you suggest you will do, because you know we don't make any money from running the registry. We survive because of our good friends in Malta, and we're very grateful to them. I'd like to thank them on my friend Leslie Vella on World Tourism Day. But we think we're doing a little bit of good by helping people find their own pathways forward, because sure as hell we're going to have to come to terms with the new world, with harsher weather and with totally different weather, and with more and more human pressures on migration from climate refugees and war zone refugees. It's going to be a tough world, but it's the only one we've got. So I hope everybody who's listening will think about these things and take a look at what you're doing on World Tourism Network and what we're doing on Sunex Malta. Hopefully what we're going to do with the Sustainable Tourism Global Center and its science-based initiative, and see how they can make their own framework around these things, because they're only there to help the industry adapt and to change.
Yeah, and you mentioned Malta. I don't know if you know this,
Oh,
but
you were there recently.
I was
Yes.
there. I was on a initial 2.5 day vacation, and it turned out to be 5 days, thanks to Lufthansa going on strike, what I really enjoyed. But I really enjoyed my time in Malta. It's a great destination. I mean, there's so much in culture and people, and it's lively, and I enjoyed it. It was my first time actually to Malta, and I'm glad Malta steps up to the problem of climate change. That is definitely a very important to support
Well,
an organization like
it's a
Sunex.
crossroads. It's a crossroads of civilization, because it's got an incredible history, wonderful, wonderful buildings, great food, and yeah, maybe next time we see each other, we'll see each other in Malta.
Sounds great. For everyone else, if you missed the first part of our World Tourism Network discussion today, it's going to restart probably within an hour, and you can watch it all over, or simply go to breakingnewsshow.com. We're also going to link it from WTN.travel, livestream.travel, or go to eTurbo News, and it takes you to our YouTube channel where you find it for many years to come. But Jeffrey, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Happy World Tourism Day to you and to everyone else watching us today. And hopefully this next year will be a good one in changing the merits of tourism and contribute to the problem of climate change.
Thank you, Thomas, and to all our mutual friends out there, Alan Saint-Ange, Edmund Bartlett, Najib Balala, all those people who we've been working with over the years. A happy World Tourism Day to you too.
Happy World Tourism Day. Aloha from Hawaii.
Aloha.
Bye-bye.
Bye.